Welcome to our Bible study for July 6th of 2025. We have now moved from the Old Testament and a number of altars that we saw people erecting in the Old Testament into now the New Testament. Most of the rest of this quarter will be focused on the life of Jesus, and most of it on Jesus in the temple. And we begin with the second time, I suppose, that we hear about at least Jesus being in the temple. He was in the temple first when he was 8 days old, and then again at year 12, although it appears that this may be his 12th or 13th trip to the temple, and you'll see that from our lesson. So let me read this very familiar story to you from the Gospel of Luke, and it's only found in the Gospel of Luke. Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. So every year they're going from Nazareth to Jerusalem, a pretty good trip. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of this. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them, and his mother treasured all of these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. Well, a number of years ago, our family did an out west camping trip. My children were probably maybe 6 and 8 at the time, and we went. One of the places we went was to Arches National Park. And early one morning, we decided, we probably being me, that we would hike out to an arch that's called Sandstone Arch, and it's only about a quarter of a mile hike into the desert. And of course, rule number one when hiking in the desert is take water with you. But this was early in the morning. It was a very short hike, and so I said, we'll just leave the water in the van here, and we'll hike over to the arch and then come back and then continue our day. And so we get to Sandstone Arch and we take the pictures, and it's a great time and everything is fine. And then I look at the map and I realize, well, you know what? Broken Arch is just another maybe half a mile or so over, and just behind Broken Arch a little ways is a campground. And so what we can do is let's hike over to Broken Arch, and we will get to see Broken Arch, and then I'll hike back across the desert to the van, and y'all can hike to the campground and find some shade there in the campground, and I'll come pick you up in the campground. So we hike over to Broken Arch, and we do that, and then we go according to plan. And by this time it was getting really, really hot, and I was a little worried. Even though it was early in the morning, the heat was already way up there. I knew my family was thirsty, I was thirsty, and so I ran all the way back to the van, 3/4 of a mile or a mile back to the van. I got into the van, drove around to the campground where I thought I'd find them, and they were nowhere to be found. And as it turns out, as they were making their way from that arch to the campground, they missed a turn and ended up hiking further into the desert. But I didn't know that at the time. So I'm looking everywhere, I can't find them. I'm thinking surely by now they were able to get from the arch to the campground, but who knows? And so I hiked the trail from the campground to the arch, no family. So I came back to the campground, and now I'm getting really, really worried because my family is apparently lost in the desert. They have no water. I had been very thirsty, and I had been able to drink some water when I got to the van, but of course they hadn't had that opportunity. I think I drove one other place and looked where I thought they could be if they had missed the trail. I couldn't find them. I drove back to where we were supposed to meet, and there my kids were sitting on the pavement in some shade outside of a restroom. And I said, "Where is your mother?" And they said, "Well, she went looking for you." And so she's now out in the desert somewhere. And so I grabbed a bottle of water and I rushed out in the desert, and I found Lee and brought her back, and of course gave her the water and all that kind of stuff. And all's well that ends well. However, ever since that time, and it's now been more than 20 years, that we tell that story. If I am telling that story, the title of that story is The Day That I Saved My Family in the Wilderness. I ran a mile across. I ran back to the arch. I came back. I ran back to the arch again to finally. Yeah, I was the one frantically rushing to the desert so that I could make sure that I could save my family. What my children say is, it was the day Daddy abandoned us in the desert. and that's the way they remember that story. Well, this story about Jesus and his parents, I think, is probably similar. In the years that came when they talked about that story, Mary and Joseph probably said, this was when Jesus abandoned us in Jerusalem. And Jesus may have said, this is when you didn't realize what I was supposed to be doing, that I had to be in my Father's house. You should have known all along what was going on. This is the only story we get of Jesus as a young boy. We have the infancy stories that Matthew and Luke give us, and then we get this story, and then the next thing we see happening is Jesus beginning his formal ministry, probably around the age of 30. And so we have this huge gap in there. We only have this one little story, and we wonder what is going on. Well, first, it's clear Luke is not writing a biography and trying to get all of the details in there. Another family trip that we took a few years after that one out west was to Kentucky, and we did several stops along Lincoln's life, Abraham Lincoln's life. We went to the Sinking Spring Farm where he was born in Hodgenville, Kentucky, and toured that and got to see, I think it's a replica of the log cabin that he was born in. He was famously born in the log cabin. And then we got to see his boyhood home in Knob Creek in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and that was where he spent the years from 2.5 years old until 8 years old. And those were pretty formative years for him, and it's nice that we know some stories about that. He remembered at a very young age having to run errands and do chores, and he had to carry water from the well to the house, and he remembers having to carry firewood. That's also a time he says he can remember fishing. He remembers picking berries. He remembers his mother reading the Bible to him at night when he would be getting ready to go to bed. He remembered being saved from drowning by a friend of his named Austin Gallagher, and the two boys were at the edge of a creek, and Lincoln fell in, or maybe they were swimming, I'm not sure, but the current got too much and he was being swept downstream. He was afraid he was going to get drowned, but his friend Austin grabbed a branch and stuck the tree branch out, and Lincoln was able to grab the branch, and Austin was able to pull him to safety. And the reason I just tripped up on that was I was already thinking ahead. It was while that Lincoln was at Knob Creek that he first saw slaves, and he saw slaves, I think, being marched down the road in front of his house. And at a young age, it was obvious to him that was unjust and that was oppressive. And even though he was young, it was clear to him that was not the right thing to do. And we can see from a lot of those stories him learning about hard work, him learning how to read and hearing those Bible stories, him being saved by his friend, maybe learning a little bit about compassion, and then him seeing the slaves. All of those things are some prefiguring to what happened to him later in life. Nobody at that time would have foreseen the greatness that he would exhibit, including him probably, and realize that he would not only be the president, but quite possibly the best president our country has ever had. Well, Luke is not writing a biography of Jesus where we can get all of those details. What he says is to Theophilus, and that means God lover, which could be you or me he's writing to. I want to write an orderly account. There have been a lot of accounts about Jesus. I'm going to write an orderly account, and the idea is so that we might come to faith in Jesus or have faith in Jesus. So that's what's going on here. But he does give us this story, and I wonder if it's not because he is trying to help us see a little bit of prefiguring of what Jesus is going to be, who he is going to be, and who he is going to become, kind of like we can do with Abraham Lincoln and other figures as well. Scholars debate, when did Jesus become aware of his divinity? We know and believe Jesus was 100% human and 100% divine, 100% God, and yet the baby in the cradle, in the manger, could not have the awareness that he was God. At least in my opinion, he could not, because then he really wouldn't be 100% human. He would just be acting out a role, but not really being human. And so I don't think the baby in the manger necessarily knew that he was divine, but as Jesus began to grow up as a young boy, he was obviously special. And he knew he was special in some ways, and it may be that although he was tempted by sin, like some of his friends were, he never engaged in it. And perhaps early on it only looked like he was a rule follower, maybe, but he just, although he was tempted, he never gave in. And perhaps he was getting a dawning awareness of who he was. He apparently has that awareness by the time we get to this story, because when Mary and Joseph, after frantically looking for him for 3 days, and you wonder if that's a prefigure itself, Jesus is missing, perhaps is gone, perhaps is dead. For 3 days they search for him and they find him on the 3rd day. Maybe that's some prefiguring, but when they find him, he just simply says, well, I don't know why you're so upset. I don't know why you had to search for me. Didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house? Well, his Father's house, if you want to call Joseph his father, is in Nazareth. But Jesus understands, and he says, this is my Father's house, and you should have known that's where I would be. In the musical, the Cotton Patch Gospel, in this scene, Jesus says, didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house? And he looks at Joseph and he says, Joe. And it's kind of a cute, almost funny way to say, you know, you are my adoptive father, you are my authority figure, you are my earthly father, however you want to put it. But you're really Joe. You're not my father. My father is the one for whom this house is for him. So we see that he understands that he is different, and now he's beginning to understand my Father is God in heaven, not Joseph. The religious leaders who he is conversing with, they understand something. Now, they don't recognize him as Messiah or recognize him as the Son of God, but it says they're amazed at the questions he asked and also at the things that he had to say. And I tend to wonder, were some of those questions that he asked sort of Socratic questions? Socrates would ask questions that would then help the people who he was talking with try to figure out the answers for themselves almost. Sometimes it was Socrates knew where he wanted the conversation to go, but he got it there by asking questions. Maybe that's what the young Jesus was as well. For Mary also, this is a story of a confirmation of who he is. For the second time, Luke tells us that she treasures these things in her heart. The first time, you may remember, was in Bethlehem. Mary has been told by Gabriel that she is going to bear the Son of God, and the Holy Spirit would be the one that she would conceive, the Holy Spirit's child. She is surely terrified by that, not sure how her parents would react, how Joseph would react, how others would react. If they believed that she had gotten pregnant by adultery, they might have stoned her. And so she goes through this terrible period. Then they go to Bethlehem, and there is what had to be a just heart-rending time of trying to find a place while she's feeling the contractions coming on. She knows the baby is almost here, and they can't find any place to be. And they finally get the stable, of course, and are able to have the birth there. And then the shepherds show up. Joseph didn't run off and tell the shepherds what was happening. Nobody went and announced the shepherds except for angels. And the shepherds come and they explain to Mary and Joseph that the angels showed up, and then a whole host of angels, the heavenly host, showed up, singing, glory to God, peace on earth, and goodwill towards all people. And so that was for Mary a confirmation of who Jesus was, and this whole journey they've been up to until now. Obviously, it wasn't a dream she had. This is real, and Jesus is the Messiah. I get the sense that in Jerusalem at age 12, Mary gets that again, as these scholars are saying, we're so amazed at him, and Jesus is saying, didn't you know I would be in my Father's house? And so once again, she treasures these things in her heart as she is reconfirmed who he is. One of the things I also like about that for me in my own life is there are times in my life I have to get reconfirmed who Jesus is for me. When I grow some in my spiritual life, there's almost like I'm learning it all over for the first time. Sometimes when perhaps there are doubts and Jesus in one way or another finds a way to reassure me and it's confirmed again, I really do treasure those things in my heart as well. And I suspect that you do also. So we're getting a glimpse here of Jesus. He is in the temple. He is in his Father's house. We will see in the coming weeks some more instances of Jesus in the temple and how he treats the temple. We see that at the very least he is as wise as the teachers, and yet he's not there yet, because Luke tells us that he grows. He increases in wisdom And in years, when I was a child, I learned in wisdom and in stature, he grew taller, but in years is another way of saying that, as he grew and aged. And he increased in both human and divine favor. He continues to follow God's will, and that continues to put him in God's favor. But he also is in human favor. Humans see him even as a child and recognize there's something special about him. And you wonder, and Dr. Estes wondered this in our lesson, was Jesus, the way he could draw a crowd around him just by his personality and his grace and his compassion, as a child, could he do that as well? And apparently the answer is yes, because he grew in human favor. This fall, November 6th through 8th, the Cumberland Presbyterian Symposium will be at First Cumberland of Chattanooga. And I hope you'll put November 6th through 8th on your calendar and plan to come to Chattanooga and be a part of that symposium. Our keynote speaker is an actor that I've known about for a long time. His name is Courtney Krueger. And one of the things that he does that's been very powerful for me is a show called Witnesses. And in that show, he plays 6 or 8 people who were witnesses to Jesus when Jesus was on earth. And some of them are people that we find in the Bible, and others are people that he has just imagined, but people nonetheless that the stories he tells just feel so real to who Jesus is. And one of those stories is a story about Jesus as a little boy. And Krueger tells it through the eyes of another little boy. And the boy says that his father had died at an early age, and so his mother had to move around from relative to relative, and they'd go to one relative's house, and then they'd wear out their welcome, and they'd have to go to another relative's house. And because his father had died, his mother was incredibly protective of him. She didn't want to lose him. But every time they went to a new place, it just got harder and harder for him. And one day they moved to Nazareth to be with relatives in Nazareth. And he goes to school for the first day. And after school, all of the school bully and all of his little gang gather up around him. As he puts it, they came to give me a welcoming party. And they start pushing him around, and they're calling him names. And he says, you know, I didn't have a father in my life. I didn't know what to do. I put up my hands, tried to, like I thought I was supposed to do, but that just encouraged them all the more. And he said, then I began to cry. And he said, that was the worst thing possible I could have done. And when he began to cry, the bully pushed him down, grabbed handfuls of dirt and was shoving it in his face and was getting ready to start pummeling him with his fists. And he said, my eyes were shut, but I felt the bully get pulled off of me. And he said, I opened my eyes and I hoped to see a very large adult, but instead it was another boy, and I didn't know where he had come from. But he pulled the bully off, and he was a lot smaller than the bully, but he said to the bully, if you want to pick on somebody, you pick on me. And the bully turned and put up his fist and punched the other boy in the nose, and his nose just exploded and blood was pouring down. But that kind of took all the steam out of the bully for whatever reason. And the bully stalked off and took his team with him, and they left. Well, that other boy, of course, was Jesus, the Krueger character tells us. And he says, Jesus looks at him and says, oh boy, I thought we were done for a minute there. The little boy says, thanks him profusely. He says, I don't know how to thank you enough. And the boy Jesus says, that's okay. That's why I'm here. Powerful line. And then the Krueger character says, and I don't know how he did it, but somehow Jesus and Jesus' mom convinced my mom to let me play with Jesus and with his brothers. And they taught me how to play games, and we wrestled. And he says, and actually, Jesus taught me how to be a boy. Now, that is not a true story about Jesus, of course. It's something that the actor Courtney Krueger made up. And yet I find that so beautiful. And there are these wonderful prefigurings there, just like there are in Luke's story, where Jesus says to the bully, if you want to pick on somebody, you pick on me. That's what Jesus says to death for us. That's what Jesus says to Satan for us. And so that's exactly what happens. The attention turns from us to Jesus. And Jesus takes what we were going to get, and yet then Jesus, when we thank him, he simply says, that's why I'm here. And then Jesus goes and teaches us how to be human. We see it here in this early story, and we see it in this story from Kurt Cloninger, and I hope that will help us have a greater appreciation for Jesus, who was fully God and fully divine from the moment he was born until even this day. And thanks be to God for that wonderful gift that Jesus has given to us.